The Winnipeg Secret, a family's dark legacy. The perfect portrait. The photograph arrived at the Manitoba Theological Society on a crisp October morning in 2024, delivered by an elderly woman named Eleanor Hartwell, whose grandmother had recently passed away. Sarah Chen, the Society's lead historian, carefully unwrapped the agate frame, revealing a sepia-toned family portrait that would soon turn her world upside down. The image showed the Blackwood family of Winnipeg, taken in the summer. 5 figures stood arranged on the front porch of an elegant Victorian home. Patriarchal William Blackwood, his wife Margaret, their 3 children, Thomas aged 16, Elizabeth aged 14, and little Mary. They were dressed in their finest clothes, the picture of Edwardian prosperity and respectability. What struck Dr. Chen immediately was how genuinely happy they appeared. Unlike the stern, formal poses typical of early photography, the Blackwoods were actually smiling. William's hand rested protectively on his wife's shoulder. Margaret's eyes sparkled with warmth, and the children displayed the carefree joy of youth. It was, by all appearances, the portrait of a perfect family. My great-great-grandmother kept this hidden in her attic for over a century, Eleanor explained as Dr. Chen examined the photograph under a magnifying glass. She never spoke about the Blackwoods, but when we were cleaning out her things, we found this along with some old newspaper clippings in the diary. Dr. Chen nodded absently, already captivated by the image. She had spent 15 years studying Winnipeg's early history, and the Blackwood name was familiar to her. William Blackwood had been a prominent businessman in the city's early days, involved in grain trading and real estate development. His family had been well regarded in society circles, known for their charitable work and community involvement. The diary entries are disturbing, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm not sure I want to know what they mean, but I thought historians should see them. Eleanor handed over a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was feminine and elegant, clearly belonging to someone educated and refined. Dr. Chen opened to a random page and began to read. August 15, Nintos Mintos Into. The children are asking questions again. Thomas found the locked room in the basement yesterday, and I had to tell him it was storage. How much longer can we keep this secret? William says we must think of our reputation, our standing in the community. But at night, I hear the sounds. Dr. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. She flipped to another entry, September 3rd, 1905. Mary had nightmares again, last night. She keeps talking about the sad people in the basement. Children see things adults choose to ignore. I fear what we become, what we've allowed to happen in the name of prosperity. Mrs. Hartwell, Chen said slowly. Do you have any idea what these entries might be referring to? Eleanor shook her head. That's why I brought them to you. My great-great-grandmother, Ruth Morrison, worked as a seamstress in Winnipeg around that time. She never married, never had children of her own. She just these, inspires from old records. After Ninoton Dios Audoncetu Abses. Dr. Chen made a note to research Ruth Morrison's background. Something about this entire situation felt deeply unsettling, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The photograph that had initially seemed so charming now appeared almost sinister in light of the diary entries. I'll need to do some research, Dr. Chen told Eleanor. Would you mind if I kept these items for a few weeks? I'll take excellent care of them. Eleanor nodded eagerly. Please, keep them as long as you need. I just want to understand what happened to that family. After Eleanor left, Dr. Chen spent the rest of the day poring over the photograph and diary. She used her computer to enhance the image, looking for any details that might provide clues. The Blackwood house was clearly substantial, with ornate Victorian architecture typical of Winnipeg's wealthy district. In the background, she could make out what appeared to be a carriage house and extensive grounds. But it was the family themselves that continued to fascinate her. The more she studied their faces, the more she noticed subtle details that hadn't been apparent at first glance. William Blackwood's smile, while broad, didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret's hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white with tension, and the children, there was something in their expressions that suggested they were trying very hard to appear happy. Dr. Chen decided to start her research with city records from 1900. The Winnipeg of that era was a booming frontier city, growing rapidly as immigrants poured in from Eastern Europe and elsewhere. It was a time of great opportunity, but also of significant social tensions and economic disparities. She pulled up property records for the Blackwood residence at 2037 Wellington Crescent, one of the city's most prestigious addresses. The house had been built in 1898 and was indeed owned by William Blackwood from 1900 until 1996, when it was suddenly sold to a bank for a fraction of its assessed value. That was odd. Why would a successful businessman sell his family home for so little money? Chen dug deeper into newspaper essays from the period. The Blackwood family appeared frequently in the society pages, attending charity galas, hosting dinner parties, contributing to various causes. William was described as a pillar of the community, a self-made man who had built his fortune through hard work and shrewd investments. But then, in late 1990, the last social event the family attended was a harvest festival in October 19, just a few months after the photograph was taken. After that, they seemed to vanish from Winnipeg's social scene entirely. If you're enjoying this mysterious historical investigation, please like this video to help us reach more history enthusiasts. Your support helps us continue uncovering these fascinating stories from the past. As the afternoon wore on, Chen found herself becoming increasingly absorbed in the mystery. She contacted colleagues at other historical societies across Canada, asking if anyone had information about the Blackwood family or similar cases from the early 19th. Michael Thompson at the Ontario Historical Society was particularly intriguing. He had encountered similar cases in Toronto and Ottawa, prominent families who had suddenly disappeared from public life, leaving behind only fragments of their stories and unexplained circumstances. There's a pattern, Dr. Thompson told her during a phone call. Wealthy families, often involved in immigration or labor-related businesses, who seem to vanish overnight. The official records are always vague, relocated for business purposes or moved to pursue opportunities elsewhere. But when you dig deeper, you find these disturbing hints of something much darker. Dr. Chen felt her pulse quicken. What kind of hints? Unexplained deaths among immigrant workers, reports of people going missing, whispers about families who exploited vulnerable populations. It's as if there was a systematic cover-up of some kind of, well, I hate to use the word, but it almost sounds like human trafficking. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Chen stared at the photograph of the smiling Blackwood family, and suddenly their expression seemed far more sinister than charming. Dr. Thompson, she said slowly, I think I may have found another piece of this puzzle. That evening, Chen stayed late at the Historical Society, on only way to shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something significant. She returned to Ruth Morrison's diary, reading more carefully this time, looking for clues she might have missed. October Dorlet, Ninty Kendall no longer remains silent. What I have seen in that house, it haunts my dreams. The basement rooms, the chains, the terrified faces of those poor souls. Mr. Blackwood calls them workers, but I know what they really are. Slaves. In Canada, in 1905, there are slaves. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as she read. If Ruth Morrison's account was accurate, the Blackwood family had been involved in something far worse than simple exploitation. They had been running what amounted to a slavery operation in the heart of Winnipeg. She flipped to the next entry, October 1920. No, He tried to help one of them escape today. A young woman barely older than Elizabeth Blackwood. She spoke no English, but her eyes told the story of unimaginable suffering. We almost made it to the police station, but Mr. Blackwood's men found us. But I fear what will happen to her now. I fear what will happen to me. The diary entries ended abruptly after that date. Dr. Chen checked the remaining pages, but they were all blank. Whatever had happened to Ruth Morrison, she had stopped writing about it. As Dr. Chen sat alone in the darkened historical society, surrounded by the artifacts of Winnipeg's past, she realized she had stumbled upon something that could rewrite the city's history. The Blackwood family, pillars of the community, charitable benefactors, respected citizens, they had been monsters. An edge's photograph, with its seemingly innocent smiles and picture-perfect family portrait, was evidence of one of the most horrifying secrets in Canadian history. Dr. Chen arrived at the Historical Society the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose and a growing sense of dread. She had spent most of the night researching immigration patterns in early 1900s Winnipeg, and what she had discovered painted a disturbing picture of vulnerability and exploitation. Between 1896 and 1914, over 400,000 immigrants had arrived in Western Canada, many of them Eastern Europeans, fleeing poverty and persecution. Winnipeg served as a crucial gateway city, where newcomers would often spend weeks or months before moving on to homesteads or other destinations. It was a perfect environment for predators who knew how to exploit the desperate and the displaced. Dr. Chen had also spent considerable time studying the enhanced photograph. Using modern digital analysis tools, she had been able to reveal details that would have been impossible to see with the naked eye in night. What she found made her stomach turn. In the background of the image, barely visible behind the main house, she could make out what appeared to be a second building, likely the carriage house mentioned in Ruth Morrison's diary. But more disturbing were the shadows in the windows of the main house. When enhanced and magnified, several of the windows showed what appeared to be faces, pale, gaunt faces that definitely did not belong to the Blackwood family. She had also discovered something else troubling about the photograph itself. The date stamp on the back indicated it was taken on July 15, 1950, but the clothing and seasonal details suggested it was actually taken much later in the year, possibly in October. Someone had deliberately mislabeled the photograph, perhaps to create an alibi or to obscure the timeline of events. Dr. Chen's first stop that morning was the Winnipeg Police Museum, where historical records from the early 90s. Detective Inspector James Crawford, a friend who specialized in cold cases, had agreed to help her search through missing persons reports from night. This is highly irregular, Crawford warned, as he led her through the archive. These records are over a century old, and many of them were never properly investigated in the first place. The police force was much smaller then, and they didn't always take missing immigrant reports serious. They spent hours combing through yellowed police reports, many handwritten in fading ink. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Between July and December 1905, there had been an unusually high number of missing persons reports filed by members of Winnipeg's immigrant community. Most involved young adults who had arrived in the city recently and then simply vanished. "Look at this," Crawford said, pointing to a report dated October this year. Anna Kowalski, age 39, arrived from Poland 3 weeks earlier. Last seen near Wellington Crescent. Her brother files the report, but there's no follow-up investigation noted. Dr. Chen felt her heart race. Wellington Crescent was where the Blackwood house was located. Are there others near that area? Crawford nodded grimly. At least 6 more that I can find. All young immigrants, all last seen in or around the Wellington Crescent area. All between July and December 1905. They found reports for Dmitry Volkov, a 22-year-old Russian, Maria Santos, a 18-year-old from Portugal, Eric Larsen, a 20-year-old Norwegian, and several others. In each case, the investigation had been perfunctory at best, with notes suggesting the missing persons had likely moved on to other opportunities or returned to their home countries. This wasn't incompetence, Dr. Chen realized. This was deliberate negligence. Someone was ensuring these cases weren't properly investigated. Crawford pulled out a thick ledger book. "Let me check something," he said, flipping through pages of names and dates. "This is a record of police payoffs and donations from prominent citizens. It was supposed to be confidential, but..." He stopped at an entry and pointed. "There, William Blackwood. Multiple payments to the Police Benevolent Fund, always just after missing persons reports were filed." Dr. Chen stared at the evidence in disbelief. It was buying their silence. "It looks that way, and it gets worse." Crawford showed her another section of the ledger. Several police officers received consulting fees from Blackwood's businesses. They were on his payroll. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. William Blackwood hadn't just been exploiting vulnerable immigrants. He had corrupted the very system that was supposed to protect them. Dr. Chen's next stop was the Manitoba Provincial Archives, where she hoped to find more information about William Blackwood's business operations. The archivist, Dr. Helen Kowalski, was intrigued by the investigation. Blackwood had his fingers in many pies. Dr. Kowalski explained that she pulled files from storage. Grain trading, real estate, construction, and here's something interesting. He had contracts with the Immigration Department to provide temporary housing for new arrivals. Dr. Chen felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He had official access to vulnerable immigrants. Exactly. His company, Blackwood Enterprises, was contracted to provide lodging and work placement services for newcomers who couldn't immediately move on to their final destinations. It would have given him perfect cover for what you're suggesting. The business records painted a picture of a sophisticated operation. Blackwood had multiple properties around Winnipeg where immigrants were supposedly housed temporarily. But the records showed discrepancies, people checking in but never checking out, payments for services that were never documented, and a complex web of shell companies that made it difficult to track exactly what was happening. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Kowalski said quietly, "I think you should see this." She handed over a folder marked "Confidential Government Correspondence." Inside were letters between William Blackwood and various government officials, including members of Parliament and immigration officers. One letter, dated September 9, 2005, was particularly damning. "Dear Minister Patterson, I write to assure you that the concerns raised about my housing facilities are entirely unfounded. The immigrants under my care are well treated and properly compensated for their labor. Any reports to the contrary are the result of misunderstandings or malicious rumors spread by competitors. I trust that our long-standing relationship and my contributions to the Conservative Party will ensure that these baseless accusations receive no further attention. Your faithful servant, William Blackwood." "Air protection at the highest levels," Dr. Chen murmured. "This wasn't just local corruption, it went all the way to Ottawa." Dr. Kowalski nodded. "And look at this response from the minister." The reply was brief but telling. "Blackwood, your concerns are noted. I have instructed the immigration inspectors to focus their attention elsewhere. Your continued support of our party's initiatives is greatly appreciated. Regards, Minister Patterson." Dr. Chen felt sick.
The government had known, or at least suspected, what was happening, and they had chosen to look the other way in exchange for political support. This investigation is revealing shocking truths about Canadian history. Please comment below with your thoughts on how such atrocities could have been covered up for over a century. Your engagement helps us continue this important work. As the day wore on, Dr. Chen's investigation took an even darker turn. She had arranged to meet with Dr.
Patricia Whitehorse, a specialist in Indigenous history, who had been researching similar patterns of exploitation among First Nations communities. What you're describing isn't unique to immigrant populations, Dr. Whitehorse explained over coffee. There were systematic efforts to exploit indigenous people as well, often using similar methods, false promises of work, debt bondage, and the complicity of government officials. She showed Chen documents detailing how indigenous people had been forced into labor arrangements that were slavery in all but name. The difference is that these crimes against indigenous people were often legal under the laws of the time. What Blackwood was doing to immigrants was illegal even then, which is why it had to be hidden. Dr. Whitehorse had also uncovered evidence that some of Blackwood's operations extended beyond Winnipeg. There are similar patterns in Regina, Calgary, and even Vancouver. It appears there was a network of these operations across Western Canada. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had started as an investigation into one family's dark secret was revealing a systematic network of human trafficking and exploitation that had operated with government protection across multiple provinces. Dr. Whitehorse said seriously, "You need to be careful. There are still powerful families in this country whose wealth and status can be traced back to these kinds of operations. They won't want this information to become public." That evening, Dr. Chen returned to her office to find that someone had been there. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but her files had been disturbed, and her computer showed signs of being accessed. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that her investigation had attracted unwanted attention. She quickly made copies of all her research and stored them in multiple locations. Whatever forces had protected the Blackwood family's secrets for over a century were apparently still active. As she prepared to leave for the night, Dr. Chen's phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor Hartwell's number. "Dr. Chen," Eleanor's voice was shaky and frightened. "Someone broke into my house today. They didn't take anything valuable, but they went through all my grandmother's things. I think they were looking for more documents about the Blackwoods." Dr. Chen felt her blood run cold. "Are you safe? Do you need me to call the police?" "I'm staying with my sister tonight," Eleanor replied. "But Dr. Chen, I found something else, hidden in the frame of that photograph. I think you need to see it right away." Dr. Chen met Eleanor Hartwell at the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment the next morning. Eleanor had insisted on police protection after the break-in, and Sergeant Maria Santos, whose great-grandmother had been one of the missing immigrants from 19 Middle Shrink, had taken a personal interest in the case. "Show me what you found," Dr. Chen said, as they sat in a secure conference room. Eleanor carefully removed a small, folded piece of paper from an evidence bag. "It was hidden behind the backing of the photograph frame," she explained. "I only found it because the frame was damaged during the break-in." The paper was fragile with age, covered in the same elegant handwriting as Ruth Morrison's diary. Dr. Chen read aloud, "If you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I have hidden this evidence, where I pray it will someday be found by someone with the courage to seek justice. The Blackwood family is not what they appear to be. Behind their charitable facade lies a horror that I can barely bring myself to describe. They are operating a slave trade in the heart of Winnipeg, targeting vulnerable immigrants who have no one to protect them. I have documented everything I have seen. The basement of their house contains cells where dozens of people are held against their will. They are forced to work in terrible conditions, beaten if they resist, and sold to other operations across the country when they become too weak or troublesome. William Blackwood has corrupted police officers, government officials, and business leaders. He has created a network of evil that extends far beyond Winnipeg. The photograph I have hidden this note behind was taken on the day they murdered 3 people who tried to escape. The family is smiling because they believe they are untouchable. I have tried to help, but I fear I have been discovered. If something happens to me, please know that I died trying to do what was right. The evidence is hidden in the basement of the house at 20. Look for the loosest stone behind the furnace. May God forgive us all for what we have allowed to happen. Ruth Morrison. October 10. Ruth Morrison hadn't just witnessed the Blackwood family's crimes, she had documented them in hidden evidence that might still exist. Sergeant Santos was the first to speak. "We need to get a warrant to search that property immediately." The house was demolished and Chen said, crossing their hopes. "It's a condominium complex now, but the basement might still exist," Eleanor suggested. "Those old houses had deep foundations. When they built the condos, they might have just built over the original basement." Sergeant Santos made some phone calls and discovered that Eleanor was right. The original basement of the Blackwood house had been partially preserved and incorporated into the foundation of the new building. With the cooperation of the condominium board and a hastily obtained search warrant, they arranged to access the basement that afternoon. Dr. Chen spent the morning researching the construction history of the site. The Blackwood house had been sold to a bank in 1906, then remained empty for several years before being purchased by a developer who converted it into apartments. It had served as rental property until the 1920s, when it was finally demolished to make way for the current condominium complex. Interestingly, there were reports of strange incidents at the property over the years. Tenants had complained of unexplained sounds, cold spots, and a general feeling of unease in the basement areas. Several tenants had moved out suddenly, claiming the building was haunted. "Maybe it was haunted," Dr. Chen thought grimly, "by the spirits of people who died there." The search team assembled at 2727 Wellington Crescent. That afternoon included Dr. Chen, Sergeant Santos, a forensic archaeologist named Dr. James Mitchell, and several SRPNP officers. The current residents of the condominium complex had been evacuated as a precaution. The basement of the modern building was unremarkable: concrete walls, utility pipes, and storage areas, but Dr. Mitchell's ground-penetrating radar quickly identified anomalies beneath the current floor. "There's definitely an older structure down there," he reported. "The floor level was raised by about 4 feet when they built this building. The original basement is still intact. Underneath, using jackhammers and excavation tools, the team carefully broke through the modern concrete floor. What they found beneath made everyone step back in shock. The original basement was a maze of small rooms, exactly as Ruth Morrison had described: stone walls, heavy wooden doors with iron bars, and chains still attached to the walls. It was unmistakably a prison designed to hold human beings against their will. "My God," Sergeant Santos whispered, "it's true." William Pal began documenting everything with photographs and measurements. The basement was larger than expected, extending under what would have been the carriage house and gardens of the original property. There were at least 20 separate cells, each barely large enough for a person to lie down. In one corner they found what appeared to be a workshop where shackles and chains had been manufactured. In another area, there were the remains of a primitive kitchen where minimal food had been prepared for the prisoners, but it was Dr. Chen who made the most significant discovery. Following Ruth Morrison's instructions, she searched behind the old furnace until she found a loose stone. Behind it was a metal box, miraculously preserved after more than a century. Inside the box were documents that would rewrite Canadian history. Ruth Morrison had been meticulous in her documents. There were lists of names, dates, and descriptions of the people who had been held in the basement. There were copies of correspondence between William Blackwood and his associates across the country. There were even photographs, horrifying images of the conditions in which people had been forced to live. One document was particularly damning, a ledger showing the sale and transfer of human beings to operations in other cities. People were listed like livestock, with prices based on their age, health, and skills. "This is evidence of the largest human trafficking operation in Canadian history," Dr. Mitchell said as he examined the documents. "And it was operating with full government knowledge and protection." Among the names in Ruth Morrison's lists, Dr. Chen found Anna Kowalski, Dmitry Volkov, Maria Santos, and all the other missing immigrants they had identified in the police records. But there were dozens more, people whose disappearances had never even been reported. The most chilling discovery was a series of photographs showing the Blackwood family posing with government officials and business leaders at various social events. These weren't just isolated criminals, they were part of a broader network of corruption and exploitation that included some of the most prominent figures in Canadian society. CT3, the evidence we're uncovering is shocking and needs to be shared. Please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this investigation. This story needs to be told. As the team continued their excavation, they made an even more disturbing discovery. In the deepest part of the basement, they found human remains, dozens of skeletons that had been hastily buried in unmarked graves. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary examination suggested that many of the victims had died from malnutrition, disease, or violence. Some showed the signs of having been shot or beaten to death. The evidence painted a picture of systematic murder on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. "We're going to need a much larger team," Sergeant Santos said, calling for additional forensic specialists. "This is a crime scene of massive proportions." As news of the discovery began to leak out, Dr. Chen found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters from across Canada and around the world descended on Winnipeg, eager to learn more about what was being called Canada's hidden Holocaust. But with the media attention came increased pressure from powerful interests who wanted the story suppressed. Dr. Chen received threatening phone calls, her research was questioned by anonymous critics, and there were attempts to discredit her finding. "They're scared," Eleanor Hartwell told her during one of their meetings. "After all these years, they're still scared of what Ruth Morrison documented." Dr. Chen was beginning to understand why. As she delved deeper into the network of corruption that had protected the Blackwood operation, she discovered connections to families and institutions that remained powerful in modern Canada. Some of the country's most respected business dynasties, political families, and social organizations could trace their wealth and influence back to the exploitation documented in Ruth Morrison's evidence. The photograph that had started it all, the smiling Blackwood family and their perfect Victorian portrait, had become a symbol of how evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. But it was also becoming a symbol of hope, proof that the truth could eventually emerge, no matter how deeply it was buried. As Dr. Chen prepared for the next phase of her investigation, she knew she was fighting not just to expose historical crimes, but to confront a legacy of injustice that continued to shape Canadian society. The Blackwood family's victims deserved justice, even if it came more than a century too late. And somewhere in the darkness of that basement prison, Ruth Morrison's courage was finally being vindicated. Her hidden evidence was speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves, demanding that their stories be told and their suffering be acknowledged. The investigation was far from over. In fact, Dr. Chen was beginning to realize that what they had uncovered in Winnipeg might be just the tip of the iceberg. The forensic excavation of the Blackwood basement continued for 2 weeks, during which time the site became one of the most significant archaeological crime scenes in Canadian history. Mitchell's team had uncovered the remains of 47 individuals, ranging in age from teenagers to adults in their 30s. Each skeleton told a story of suffering and premature death that had been hidden for over a century. Chen worked closely with genealogists and immigration historians to identify as many victims as possible. Using Ruth Morrison's meticulous records and modern DNA analysis, they were able to put names to many of the remains. Anna Kowalski, the young Polish woman whose disappearance had been reported in 1905, was among them. So was Dmitry Volkov, the Russian immigrant, and Maria Santos, whose descendant was now investigating the crimes as an RCMP sergeant. The emotional impact on the families was profound. Sergeant Santos broke down when DNA analysis confirmed that the remains of Maria Santos, her great-grandmother, had been found in the basement. She didn't abandon her family. Santos said through tears. She was murdered, and we never knew. But the investigation was revealing something even more disturbing than the crimes themselves, the extent of the cover-up that had protected the perpetrators for over a century. Chen had been working with investigative journalist David Kim from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation to trace the network of corruption that had enabled the Blackwood operation. What they discovered was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Canadian society. "Look at this," Kim said, showing Dr. Chen a document he had obtained through Freedom of Information requests. "This is an Insider's report from the Department of Immigration to the Prime Minister's office. They knew exactly what was happening, and they chose to suppress it. The report, marked confidential, not for public release, detailed an investigation into William Blackwood's operations that had been conducted by government inspectors. The findings were damning: evidence of forced labor, physical abuse, and systematic exploitation of immigrants. But instead of prosecuting Blackwood, the government had quietly shut down the investigation and transferred the inspectors to other duties." "Why would they cover it up?" Dr. Chen asked. "Politics and money," Kim replied. "Blackwood was a major contributor to the Conservative Party, and his operations were generating significant tax revenue. Plus, there were concerns about how the scandal would affect immigration to Western Canada. They were more worried about the country's reputation than about justice for the victims. The cover-up had been systematic and thorough. Police reports had been altered or destroyed. Witnesses had been intimidated or relocated, and government officials who tried to pursue the investigation had been silenced or removed from their positions. Dr. Chen discovered that Ruth Morrison herself had been a victim of this cover-up. After her disappearance in late 1995, there had been a brief police investigation, but it had been quickly closed with a notation that she had left the city voluntarily. In reality, Ruth Morrison's body was found among the remains in the Blackwood basement, a bullet hole in her skull indicating she had been murdered for trying to expose the truth. "She was a hero," Dr. Chen said, as she examined Ruth's remains. "She died trying to save people, and then they erased her from history." The investigation was also revealing the international scope of the trafficking network. Using Ruth Morrison's documents and modern investigative techniques, Chen and her team were able to trace connections to similar operations across North America and Europe. William Blackwood had been part of a sophisticated international network that trafficked people across borders for forced labor. The network included shipping companies that transported victims, corrupt officials who provided documentation, and business owners who exploited the trafficked individuals in various industries. "This wasn't just a Canadian problem," explained Rebecca Foster, an expert on historical human trafficking who had joined the investigation. There were similar networks operating in the United States, Australia, and other countries that were receiving large numbers of immigrants. The Blackwood operation was just one node in a global system of exploitation. The evidence showed that victims had been trafficked from Winnipeg to operations in other Canadian cities, as well as to locations in the United States. Some had been forced to work in mines, others in factories or on farms. Many had been sold into domestic servitude or sexual exploitation. This investigation is exposing truths that have been hidden for over a century. Please share this video to help us spread awareness about this important historical revelation. The victims deserve to have their stories told. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Dr. Chen found herself facing increasing pressure to stop her investigation. Anonymous letters threatened her career and her safety. Her research funding was suddenly questioned by university administrators, and there were attempts to discredit her findings by suggesting that the evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. They're using the same tactics they used in 1995. Eleanor Hartwell observed during one of their meetings: intimidation, discrediting witnesses, and suppressing evidence. But Dr. Chen was not alone in her fight for justice. The story had captured international attention, and historians, journalists, and human rights advocates from around the world were offering their support. The Canadian government was facing increasing pressure to acknowledge the crimes and provide some form of justice for the victims and their families. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen discovered a connection between the Blackwood Network and a prominent modern Canadian family. While reviewing financial records from the early 1900s, she found evidence that the Morrison family, one of Canada's wealthiest and most influential dynasties, had been business partners with William Blackwood. The Morrison family had built their fortune on grain trading and real estate development, much of which had been financed through profits from the trafficking operation. They had also inherited several properties that had been used as holding facilities for trafficked individuals. When Dr. Chen attempted to contact the Morrison family for comment, she was met with threats of legal action and demands that she cease her investigation. The family's lawyers claimed that any connection to historical crimes was purely coincidental, and attempts to link the modern family to past events were defamatory and actionable. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, property deeds, and correspondence clearly showed that the Morrison family had been active participants in the trafficking network, not innocent beneficiaries of legitimate business activity. The revelation that one of Canada's most respected families had built their wealth on human trafficking sent shockwaves through the country's elite circles. Other prominent families began to worry about what else Dr. Chen's investigation might uncover. "This is bigger than just the Blackwood family," Dr. Chen told a packed press conference. "This is about a systematic pattern of exploitation and cover-up that has shaped Canadian society for over a century. We need to confront this history honestly if we're ever going to achieve true justice and reconciliation." The government's response was initially defensive. Officials claimed that the crimes were historical anomalies that didn't reflect modern Canadian values. But as more evidence emerged and international pressure mounted, the tone began to change. Prime Minister Sarah Thompson announced the formation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate historical human trafficking in Canada. The commission would have broad powers to compel testimony, access classified documents, and recommend compensation for victims' families. "We cannot change the past," the Prime Minister said, "but we can acknowledge it, learn from it, and ensure that such crimes never happen again." For Dr. Chen, the announcement was a vindication of everything she had fought for. But she knew that the real work was just beginning. The commission would need to investigate not just the Blackwood operation, but the entire network of trafficking and exploitation that had operated across Canada for decades. As she stood in the basement where so many people had suffered and died, Chen thought about Ruth Morrison and the courage it had taken to document these crimes. Ruth had died believing that the truth would never come to light, but her hidden evidence had finally found its voice. The photograph of the smiling Blackwood family, which had started this entire investigation, now hung in the Manitoba Historical Society as a reminder of how evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. But it was also a symbol of hope, proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually emerge. The victims of the Blackwood operation would finally have their stories told. Their suffering would be acknowledged, their names would be remembered, and their deaths would not be in vain. Justice, even if it came more than a century late, was finally within reach. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Historical Human Trafficking began its work in January 2000. The Commission's mandate was broad, to investigate all forms of human trafficking in Canada between 1967 and now, to identify victims and perpetrators, and to recommend measures for acknowledgement and compensation. Commissioner Justice Patricia Blackbird, a respected Indigenous jurist, made it clear from the outset that the Commission would not be deterred by political pressure or threats from powerful interests. "We owe it to the victims to uncover the full truth," she declared at the opening ceremony, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for some people. The Commission's first major breakthrough came when they gained access to previously classified government documents dating back to the early. These files, which had been sealed for national security reasons, revealed the true extent of government knowledge and complicity in the trafficking operations. Dr. Chen was shocked by what she found in the file. Not only had the government known about the Blackwood operation, but they had actively facilitated it as part of a broader policy to provide cheap labor for Canada's growing economy. "Look at this," she told Commissioner Blackburn, showing her a memo. The Department of Immigration was actually coordinating with trafficking networks to ensure a steady supply of workers for mines, factories, and farms. The memo, written by Deputy Minister Charles Whitman, was chillingly bureaucratic in its tone. The irregular labor arrangements in Western Canada, while not officially sanctioned, serve important economic purposes. These workers, though not technically free, are contributing to national development in ways that would not be possible through conventional immigration channels. It is recommended that enforcement activities in this area be limited to prevent disruption of these economically beneficial arrangements. They turned human trafficking into economic policy, Commissioner Blackburn said grimly. This wasn't just corruption, it was systematic government-sanctioned slavery. The Commission's investigators, working with international partners, began to trace the full extent of the trafficking network. What they discovered was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The network had operated across multiple countries with coordination between trafficking organizations in Europe, North America, and other regions. Victims were recruited through false promises of legitimate work, transported across borders using fraudulent documentation, and then sold to various industries that needed cheap labor. In Canada alone, the Commission identified over 200 separate trafficking operations that had been active between 1920 and these operations had victimized an estimated 20,200 people, making it one of the largest human trafficking networks in modern history. The Blackwood operation in Winnipeg had been just one node in this vast network, but it had been particularly significant because of its connections to government officials and its role in trafficking people to operations across Western Canada. Chen's team had also made progress in identifying the modern beneficiaries of trafficking profits. Using forensic accounting techniques, they traced the flow of money from historical trafficking operations to present-day businesses and family fortunes. The Morrison family, whose connection to the Blackwood operation had already been exposed, was just the beginning. The investigation revealed that at least 12 of Canada's wealthiest families had built their fortunes, at least in part on trafficking profit. These families included the Hendersons, who owned the major mining company, the Clarks, who controlled the media empire, and the Sinclairs, whose real estate holdings were worth billions. All had ancestors who had been involved in trafficking operations or who had knowingly profited from trafficked labor. The wealth inequality we see in Canada today has its roots in these historical crimes, explained Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, an economist working with the Commission. Families that build their wealth through exploitation have been able to compound that advantage over generations, while the descendants of victims have remained marginalized and impoverished. The Commission's work was having a profound impact on Canadian society. As the truth about historical trafficking emerged, there were calls for reparations, criminal investigations, and fundamental changes to how the country understood its own history. But the revelations were also generating fierce resistance from those who had the most to lose. The wealthy families implicated in the trafficking network hired teams of lawyers to challenge the Commission's findings and to prevent the release of damaging information. The Morrison family filed a lawsuit claiming that the Commission was exceeding its mandate and violating their privacy rights. Other families lobbied politicians to limit the Commission's powers or to shut it down entirely. They're terrified, Eleanor Hartwell observed during one of her regular meetings with Dr. Chen. After more than a century, they're finally being held accountable for their ancestors' crimes. The pressure campaign against the Commission intensified when they began investigating connections between historical trafficking and modern organized crime. Chen's research had revealed that some of the trafficking networks from the early 1900s had evolved into criminal organizations that were still active today. The techniques, the routes, the corruption networks, they're all still there, explained Detective Inspector Crawford, who had been seconded to the commission. Some of these families didn't just inherit wealth from trafficking, they inherited the criminal infrastructure that made it possible. This revelation had serious implications for law enforcement and national security. If modern criminal organizations could trace their origins to government-sanctioned trafficking operations, it raised questions about the complicity of current institutions in ongoing crimes. The Commission's most dramatic moment came when they called William Morrison III, the current head of the Morrison family empire, to testify about his family's historical involvement in trafficking. Morrison, a prominent businessman and philanthropist, had initially refused to cooperate, but a court order compelled his appearance. Under oath, Morrison was forced to acknowledge that his family had indeed been business partners with William Blackwood and had profited from trafficking operations. But he maintained that his ancestors had been unaware of the criminal nature of these activities. My great-great-grandfather was a legitimate businessman, Morrison testified. If he was deceived by William Blackwood about the nature of their partnership, that doesn't make him complicit in any crimes. Chen, serving as an expert witness, presented evidence that contradicted Morrison's claims. Financial records, correspondence, and other documents clearly showed that the Morrison family had been active participants in the trafficking network, not innocent victims of deception. The evidence shows that your ancestor not only knew about the trafficking, but helped to expand it, Dr. Chen testified. He provided financing, transportation, and facilities for holding trafficked individuals. He was a key figure in the network, not a passive investor. Morrison's testimony became increasingly defensive as Dr. Chen presented more evidence. When shown a letter from his ancestor discussing the acquisition of new workers and the need to maintain discipline among the labor force, Morrison claimed he couldn't interpret the historical context. These are euphemisms for buying and controlling enslaved people, Dr. Chen explained to the commission. Your ancestor was discussing human beings as if they were livestock. The confrontation between Morrison and Dr. Chen became a defining moment for the commission. Here was one of Canada's most powerful businessmen being forced to confront his family's dark legacy, while a historian who had started with a simple photograph was holding him accountable for crimes committed over a century ago. Commissioner Blackbird's final questions to Morrison were pointed. Mr. Morrison, given the evidence presented today, do you acknowledge that your family's wealth was built, at least in part, on the exploitation of trafficked individuals? Morrison's answer was carefully crafted by his legal team. I acknowledge that some of my family's historical business activities may have involved practices that would be considered unacceptable by today's standards. However, I maintain that these activities were conducted within the legal and social norms of their time. It was a non-apology that satisfied no one, but it was also an admission that the Morrison family could no longer deny their connection to historical trafficking. As the commission's hearings continued, Dr. Chen reflected on how far the investigation had come, since Eleanor Hartwell had first brought her that innocent-looking family photograph. What had started as a simple historical inquiry had become a reckoning with Canada's darkest secrets. But she also knew that the hardest work was still ahead. Exposing the truth was only the first step. The real challenge would be achieving justice for the victims and ensuring that such crimes could never happen again. By the spring of 2025, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work had fundamentally changed how Canadians understood their country's history. The revelation that systematic human trafficking had operated with government sanction for decades had shattered many comfortable myths about Canada's moral superiority and humanitarian traditions. Chen herself at the center of a national conversation about historical justice and contemporary responsibility. Her meticulous research had provided the foundation for the Commission's most damning findings, but it had also made her a target for those who wanted to suppress the truth. The threats against her had escalated as the Commission's work progressed. Her car had been vandalized. Her office had been broken into multiple times, and she had received death threats serious enough to warrant police protection. But she refused to be intimidated. Ruth Morrison died for this truth, she told a gathering of historians and human rights advocates. The least I can do is live for it. The Commission's interim report, released in March 2025, documented the scope of historical trafficking in unprecedented detail. The numbers were staggering. Over 100,000 victims across Canada, hundreds of trafficking operations, and systematic government complicity spanning multiple decades. But the report also named names. For the first time in Canadian history, a government commission had identified specific families and institutions that had profited from human trafficking and had traced those profits to present-day wealth and power. The Morrison family was just one of many prominent Canadian dynasties whose fortunes were revealed to have been built on trafficking profits. The Henderson mining empire, the Clark media conglomerate, the Sinclair real estate holdings, all were shown to have roots in the exploitation of trafficked individuals. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted outside the headquarters of companies owned by the implicated families. Shareholders demanding explanations and accountability. Politicians who had received donations from these families faced calls to return the money, but the families themselves remained largely defiant. Rather than acknowledging their historical responsibility, most hired public relations firms to manage the crisis and legal teams to challenge the Commission's findings. William Morrison III appeared on national television to defend his family's reputation. These are historical allegations about events that occurred over a century ago, he said. My family has contributed enormously to Canadian society through job creation, philanthropy, and civic leadership. We will not be held hostage by the past. His response was widely criticized as tone-deaf and self-serving. Protesters gathered outside Morrison Industries headquarters, carrying signs reading "Blood Money and Justice for the Victims." The Commission's work was also having international implications. Other countries were beginning to examine their own histories of government-sanctioned trafficking, and international human rights organizations were calling for a global reckoning with historical exploitation. Chen was invited to speak at conferences around the world about the Canadian investigation. Her presentation at the United Nations Human Rights Council was particularly powerful, as she used the Blackwood family photograph to illustrate how evil could hide behind facades of respectability. This photograph represents more than just one family's crimes, she told the international audience. It represents a systematic failure of institutions and societies to protect the most vulnerable. It reminds us that we must always be vigilant against those who would exploit others for profit. Back in Canada, the Commission was preparing its final recommendation. Commissioner Blackburn had made it clear that the report would include specific proposals for reparations, criminal investigations, and institutional reforms. The reparations question was particularly complex. How do you compensate the descendants of people who were trafficked over a century ago? How do you calculate damages for crimes that were systematically covered up and denied? Chen worked with economists and legal experts to develop a framework for reparations that would be both meaningful and practical. Their proposal included direct financial compensation to identify descendants of trafficking victims, funding for community development programs in affected populations, and the establishment of memorials and educational initiatives. The total cost of the reparations program was estimated at $50 billion, to be funded through a combination of government appropriations and contributions from families and institutions that had profited from trafficking. This isn't just about money, Dr. Chen explained to skeptical politicians. It's about acknowledgement, dignity, and ensuring that the victims are finally recognized as human beings who deserve better from their adopted country. The Commission also recommended criminal investigations into modern activities that could be traced to historical trafficking networks. While the original perpetrators were long dead, some of their criminal enterprises had evolved and continued to operate in various forms. Detective Inspector Crawford's investigation had identified several modern criminal organizations with direct links to historical trafficking operations. These groups were involved in contemporary human trafficking, money laundering, and other serious crimes. The corruption networks that protected trafficking in 1905 didn't just disappear, Crawford explained. They adapted and evolved. Some of the same families and institutions that cover up historical crimes are still covering up modern ones. This revelation led to a series of high-profile arrests and investigations. Several prominent businessmen were charged with money laundering and conspiracy, while government officials faced corruption charges for their roles in protecting criminal enterprises. The most shocking arrest was that of Robert Henderson, CEO of Henderson Mining and great-great-great-grandson of one of the original trafficking network leaders. Henderson was charged with operating a modern trafficking operation that brought temporary foreign workers to Canada under false pretenses and then exploited them in dangerous mining operations. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Sergeant Santos commented, as Henderson was led away in handcuffs. Some families never learned that human beings aren't commodities to be bought and sold. As the Commission prepared to release its final report, Chen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. What had started with a simple family photograph had become the largest investigation into historical human trafficking in Canadian history. The Blackwood family's smiling faces, which had once seemed so innocent and charming, now served as a powerful reminder of how evil could hide behind respectability. But they also represented hope, proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually emerge. Ruth Morrison's courage in documenting the crimes and hiding the evidence had finally been vindicated. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. The victims she had tried to save were finally being acknowledged, their stories were being told, and their suffering was being recognized. But Dr. Chen knew that the work was far from over. The Commission's report would be just the beginning of a longer process of truth, reconciliation, and justice. Canada would need to confront its dark history honestly and completely if hoped to build a more just future. As she prepared for the final Commission hearing, Dr. Chen thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this investigation. Eleanor Hartwell, who had courageously brought forward her family's hidden documents. Sergeant Santos, who had discovered the truth about her great-grandmother's fate. The descendants of trafficking victims who were finally learning what had happened to their ancestors. And she thought about the victims themselves, the thousands of people who had suffered and died in places like the Blackwood basement, whose names had been erased from history, but whose humanity could never be denied. Their stories would finally be told. Their suffering would be acknowledged. And their legacy would be a Canada that was more honest about its past and more committed to justice in its future. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report on October 3. The timing was deliberate, chosen by Commissioner Blackburn to honor the woman whose courage had made the entire investigation possible. The report was devastating in its scope and unflinching in its conclusion. Over 800 pages long, it documented the systematic trafficking of over 120,000 people in Canada between 1967 and 1920, the complicity of government institutions at all levels, and the ongoing legacy of these crimes in contemporary Canadian society. Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Manitoba as Commissioner Blackburn presented the report's key findings. The atmosphere was electric, with tension and anticipation. Media from around the world had gathered to witness what many were calling the most significant moment in Canadian historical reckoning since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable, Commissioner Blackburn declared. For over 80 decades, human trafficking operated in Canada, not as an aberration, but as a systematic feature of economic development. protected and facilitated by government institutions and elite families who prioritized profit over human dignity. The Commission identified 847 separate trafficking operations across the country, with the Blackwood network in Winnipeg serving as one of the largest and most sophisticated. The total number of victims was estimated at between 125 of 20 making it one of the largest human trafficking operations in modern history. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation of how deeply the trafficking networks had penetrated Canadian society. The Commission found evidence of complicity involving 21 members of Parliament, 116 senior government officials, 89 police chiefs, and senior officers, 67 judges and magistrates, 134 prominent business leaders, 45 religious leaders. This was not the work of a few bad actors, Commissioner Blackberg explained. This was institutional capture on a massive scale, where the very systems designed to protect people were turned into instruments of exploitation. Dr. Chen's research had been instrumental in mapping these connections. Her painstaking work, tracing financial records, correspondence and property transfers, had revealed how trafficking profits had flowed through Canadian society, creating wealth that persisted to the present day. The report's recommendations were equally comprehensive. The Commission called for immediate reparations, 75 billion in compensation, to be distributed to descendants of trafficking victims and affected communities over 10 years. Criminal investigations, referral of evidence to law enforcement for prosecution of ongoing criminal enterprises linked to historical trafficking networks, institutional reform, complete restructuring of immigration, labor and law enforcement systems to prevent future exploitation. Truth and education, mandatory inclusion of trafficking history in school, curricula and establishment of memorial sites at former trafficking locations, corporate accountability, requirements for companies and families that benefited from trafficking to contribute to reparations and acknowledge their historical responsibility. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Thousands of people gathered outside Parliament in Ottawa, demanding that the government implement the Commission's recommendations in full. Similar demonstrations took place in cities across the country, but the response from the implicated families and institutions was predictably hostile. Within hours of the report's release, lawyers representing the Morrison, Henderson, Clark, and Sinclair families issued statements rejecting the Commission's findings and threatening legal action to prevent implementation of the recommendation. William Morrison III held a defiant press conference outside his Toronto headquarters. This report is a politically motivated attack on successful Canadian families, he declared. We will fight these baseless allegations in court and will not be extorted by historical revisionism. His words only inflamed public anger. Protesters surrounded Morrison Industries buildings across the country, and the company's stock price plummeted as investors fled. Several major pension funds announced they were divesting from companies owned by the implicated families. The government's response was more measured, but ultimately supportive. Prime Minister Thompson announced that her government would implement the Commission's recommendations in full and without delay. We cannot change the past, she said in a nationally televised address, but we can acknowledge it honestly and work to repair the damage that was done. The victims of these crimes and their descendants deserve nothing less than complete justice. The announcement triggered a political crisis. Opposition parties, many of whose members have received donations from the implicated families, demanded that the government reconsider. Some conservative MPs walked out of Parliament in protest, claiming the reparations program would bankrupt the country. But public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of the Commission's recommendations. Polls showed that 78% of Canadians supported full implementations of the reparations program, even if it meant higher taxes or reduced government spending in other areas. Chen found herself At the center of the political storm, she was invited to testify before parliamentary committees, speak at rallies, and provide expert commentary for media outlets around the world. Her academic work had become a catalyst for social and political transformation. He never imagined that a single photograph could lead to all this, she told a gathering of historians and human rights advocates. But that's the power of truth. Once it emerges, it has a momentum of its own. The legal battles were intense and protracted. The implicated families spent millions of dollars trying to challenge the Commission's findings in court, but their efforts largely failed. The evidence was too overwhelming, the documentation too thorough, and the public pressure too intense. One by one, the families began to capitulate. The Henderson family was the first to break ranks, announcing that they would contribute $5 billion to the reparations fund and acknowledge their historical responsibility. "We cannot undo the past," said Jennifer Henderson, the current CEO of Henderson Mining, "but we can take responsibility for it and work to make amends." Her announcement triggered a cascade of similar acknowledgments. The Clark media empire agreed to contribute $3 billion and to dedicate significant coverage to educating the public about trafficking history. The Sinclair Real Estate Holdings committed $4 billion and agreed to provide land for memorial sites. The Morrison family held out the longest, but eventually they too were forced to acknowledge reality. Facing massive lawsuits, criminal investigations, and the complete collapse of their public reputation, William Morrison III finally agreed to a settlement that included each $1 billion in reparations and a public apology. "My family's historical involvement in these crimes was wrong," he said in a carefully scripted statement. "We acknowledge the suffering that was caused and commit to doing everything in our power to make amends." The criminal investigations recommended by the Commission also bore a fruit. Detective Inspector Crawford's team, working with international law enforcement agencies, dismantled several modern trafficking networks that had direct links to the historical operation. Robert Henderson, the mining executive who had been arrested earlier, was convicted of human trafficking and sentenced to. His conviction sent shockwaves through the business community and served as a warning that the legacy of historical crimes would not be tolerated in modern Canada. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the transformation of Canadian society's understanding of its own history. The Commission's work had shattered comfortable myths about Canadian exceptionalism and forced the country to confront the reality that it, like other nations, had a dark past that needed to be acknowledged and addressed. Schools across the country began teaching about trafficking history as part of their standard curriculum. Memorial sites were established at former trafficking locations, including the basement of the former Blackwood House in Winnipeg, which became a museum dedicated to the victims. Dr. Chen was appointed as the director of the new Canadian Institute for Historical Justice, tasked with continuing the work of investigating and documenting historical crimes. Her first major project was expanding the investigation to include trafficking of Indigenous people, which the Commission had identified as an even larger and more systematic form of exploitation. Eleanor Harwell, whose courage in bringing forward her family's documents had started the entire investigation, was honored with the Order of Canada for her contribution to historical truth and reconciliation. At the ceremony, she reflected on her great-great-grandmother's legacy. Ruth Morrison died, believing that the truth would never come to light, Eleanor said. But she was wrong. The truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried for over a century. Her courage has finally been vindicated. The Blackwood family photograph, which had started it all, was displayed in the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. As part of a permanent exhibition on historical trafficking, visitors could see the smiling faces of the Blackwood family alongside the evidence of their crimes, a powerful reminder of how evil could hide behind facades of respectability. But the photograph also served as a symbol of hope. It proved that no matter how deeply buried, no matter how well protected by wealth and power, the truth would eventually emerge. It demonstrated that ordinary people, historians, archivists, descendants of victims, could hold the powerful accountable for their crimes, as Chen has seen in the museum, looking at the photograph that had changed her life and the lives of so many others. She thought about Ruth Morrison and the courage it had taken to document these crimes en maintes adolescentes ausentes. Ruth had died, believing that justice would never come, but she had been wrong. Justice had come, even if it took 20 years. The victims of the Blackwood operation and the thousands of other trafficking operations across Canada finally had their stories told. Their suffering had been acknowledged, their humanity recognized, and their deaths given meaning. And perhaps most importantly, their legacy would help ensure that such crimes could never happen again. The systems that had protected traffickers for decades had been exposed and dismantled. The families that had profited from human misery had been held accountable. The government institutions that had enabled exploitation had been reformed. Canada had finally confronted its darkest secrets and emerged as a more honest, more just, and more compassionate nation. The smiling faces in that 90s and Alfinto Cinto photograph had tried to hide the truth, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. Ruth Morrison's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her hidden evidence had spoken for those who could no longer speak for themselves, and their voices had finally been heard. The investigation that began with a family smile had ended with a nation's reckoning. And in that reckoning there was hope for a future where such crimes would never again be hidden behind smiling faces and respectable facade. Justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived, and with it came the promise that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find a way to emerge into the light. Epilogue. The legacy continues. 5 years after the Commission's final report, Canada had become a model for other nations, grappling with their own histories of systematic exploitation. The Canadian approach, combining rigorous historical investigation, meaningful reparations, criminal accountability, and institutional reform, was being studied and replicated around the world. Dr. Chen's work had expanded beyond Canada's borders. She was leading international efforts to investigate historical trafficking networks that had operated across multiple countries, helping other nations confront their own dark pasts. The descendants of trafficking victims had used their reparations to build new lives and communities, but they had also become powerful advocates for human rights and historical justice. Many had established foundations and organizations dedicated to preventing modern trafficking and supporting survivors. The families that had been exposed by the investigation had largely faded from public prominence, their wealth diminished and their reputations forever tarnished. But some had genuinely embraced the opportunity for redemption, using their remaining resources to support anti-trafficking efforts and historical education. And in Winnipeg, at the site of the former Blackwood House, a memorial garden bloomed each spring with flowers representing the countries of origin of the trafficking victims. Visitors could walk among the plantings and read the names of those who had suffered and died there, ensuring that they would never be forgotten again. The smiling photograph of the Blackwood family remained on display in the museum, but it was now surrounded by the faces and stories of their victims. The contrast was stark and powerful, a reminder that behind every facade of respectability there might be hidden truths waiting to be discovered. Ruth Morrison's diary, carefully preserved and displayed alongside the photograph, served as a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of systematic evil. Her words continue to inspire new generations of historians, journalists, and activists who understood that the fight for truth and justice was never truly finished. The investigation that had begun with a single photograph had become a movement that transformed the nation and inspired the world. It proved that no crime, no matter how well hidden or how long ago committed, was beyond the reach of justice. And it demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil was simply the courage to tell the